Hi, I'm Brooke Hamilton, and I thought Easter was supposed to be about forgiveness and new beginnings. Instead, it became the day my mother's hand connected with my cheek in front of our entire extended family, all because I had to set one simple boundary. What happened next wasn't just family drama, it was a war waged through Sunday sermons and prayer chains, where my mother turned our entire church congregation into her personal army. But sometimes the people who claim to speak for God reveal more about themselves than they ever intended to. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The scent of honey-glazed ham and fresh dinner rolls should have been comforting as I stepped through the front door of the house on Maple Creek Road that Easter morning. Instead, the familiar aromas felt suffocating, mixing with the heavy perfume my mother Carol always wore to church and the lingering smell of Dennis's morning coffee that had grown cold on the kitchen counter. The house buzzed with that particular brand of frantic energy that comes before family gatherings, where everything has to appear perfect even when nothing underneath actually is. I had driven the 40-minute stretch from my apartment in Nashville back to Millbrook, Tennessee, like I did every major holiday, carrying a store-bought dessert and a carefully practiced smile. The dogwood trees lining the streets were in full bloom, their white petals scattered across sidewalks like confetti from a celebration I wasn't sure I wanted to attend. Something felt different this year, heavier, like storm clouds gathering just beyond the horizon of a sunny day. Carol emerged from the kitchen wearing her favorite lavender dress, the one she saved for special church occasions, her silver hair perfectly curled and sprayed into submission. She looked me up and down with that critical eye I knew so well, her gaze lingering on my simple black dress as if she could will it into something more suitable for her standards. "You're late," she said, though I was actually 5 minutes early, "and you could have at least tried to look festive. It's Easter, not a funeral." I set the chocolate cake down on the dining room table, already laden with dishes that must have taken her hours to prepare. The good china was out, the crystal glasses catching the afternoon light streaming through the lace curtain. Everything gleamed with the kind of perfection that demanded admiration, the kind that made you afraid to touch anything lest you disturb the carefully constructed image. "The dress is fine, Mom," I said quietly, smoothing down the fabric that had felt perfectly appropriate when I left my apartment. I came straight from morning service at my church. Her lips pursed at the mention of my church, the contemporary congregation I'd been attending in Nashville for the past year. It wasn't the First Baptist Church of Millbrook where I'd grown up, where she still played piano for the choir and Dennis served as a deacon. That simple fact had been a source of tension between us for months, though I'd tried to avoid the subject whenever possible. The front door opened with its familiar creak, and Uncle Frank and Aunt Linda arrived in a whirlwind of Easter greetings and pastel clothing. Linda carried a covered dish that smelled of sweet potatoes and marshmallows, while Frank hauled in a cooler full of soft drinks. Their presence immediately shifted the energy in the room, bringing with it the kind of forced cheerfulness that family gatherings often require. "Brooke, honey," Linda enveloped me in a hug that smelled of floral perfume and hairspray. "Don't you look lovely? How's that job of yours going? Carol tells us you're doing real well for yourself in the big city." The job she was referring to was my position as a social worker at a nonprofit organization that helped homeless families find temporary housing. It was meaningful work that I loved, though it didn't pay particularly well and often involved long hours dealing with heartbreaking situations. I'd tried to explain the fulfillment I found in it to my parents, but they seemed more focused on the salary than the purpose. "It's going well," I replied, accepting a glass of sweet tea from Carol. "We just helped place a family of 4 in transitional housing last week. The kids will be able to start at a new school after spring break." Frank nodded approvingly, but I caught the look that passed between Carol and Linda, the subtle eye roll that suggested they thought I was wasting my college degree on people who probably didn't deserve help anyway. It was a look I'd grown accustomed to, though it still stung every time. Dennis emerged from his study where he'd been watching a basketball game, greeting everyone with hearty handshakes and back pats. He was a large man who commanded attention simply by entering a room, his voice booming with the authority of someone who'd spent decades leading church committees and making decisions that others followed without question. In his dark suit and perfectly knotted tie, he looked every inch the respectable Southern gentleman he prided himself on being. "Brooke, girl, you look thin," he announced, as if my appearance were a topic suitable for public discussion. "You eating enough up there in Nashville? All those city restaurants serving tiny portions, I bet." "I'm fine, Dad," I assured him, though I knew from experience that protests about my weight, my living situation, or any other aspect of my life would be dismissed as easily as they were off. We settled into the living room for the traditional pre-dinner conversation, the kind of small talk that families engage in when they haven't seen each other in several weeks but aren't quite sure how to bridge the gap between obligatory check-ins and genuine connection. Linda asked about my apartment, Frank shared updates about his job at the lumberyard, and Carol detailed the various church activities she'd been organizing with the enthusiasm of someone who found deep satisfaction in being needed. "Oh, Brooke, I meant to tell you," Carol said, setting down her tea glass with a delicate clink. "Pastor Clark has been asking about you. He mentioned that he hasn't seen you at Wednesday night services in quite a while." Pastor Raymond Clark had been the minister at First Baptist for nearly 15 years, arriving when I was still in middle school and quickly establishing himself as both a spiritual leader and a central figure in the community's social hierarchy. He was the kind of man who remembered everyone's birthday, showed up at hospital bedsides without being asked, and somehow managed to make his presence feel both comforting and slightly intimidating at the same time. "I've been going to services at New Hope Community Church," I explained, referring to the congregation I'd discovered through a coworker. "It's closer to my apartment, and I really connect with Pastor Miller's teaching style." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Carol's expression shifted from casual interest to something much sharper, her eyes narrowing as if I'd just announced I'd joined a cult rather than simply found a different church home. "New Hope Community," she repeated slowly, as if testing how the words taste. "That's one of those modern churches, isn't it? With the loud music and the casual dress code." "They have contemporary worship, yes," I said carefully, "but the message is still centered on scripture. Pastor Miller actually has his doctorate in theology from Vanderbilt." Dennis leaned back in his recliner, his expression skeptical. "I've heard about those places. More concerned with entertaining people than challenging them to live right. All flash, no substance." I felt heat rising in my chest, the familiar burn of frustration that came whenever my choices were dismissed without consideration. "It's not like that, Dad. The community is very focused on serving others and living out Christ's teaching. We volunteer at homeless shelters, support single mothers, work with addiction recovery programs." "Well, that's all fine and good," Carol said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. "But there's something to be said for tradition, for staying connected to your roots. Pastor Clark baptized you, confirmed you, watched you grow up in the faith. It seems a bit disloyal to just abandon all that for whatever's trendy." The word disloyal hung in the air like a challenge. I could feel Linda and Frank watching the exchange with the uncomfortable fascination of people witnessing a family argument they'd rather not be part of. This was exactly the kind of conversation I'd hoped to avoid, but Carol had a way of steering discussions toward topics that would put me on the defensive. "I'm not abandoning anything," I said, keeping my voice level despite the tension building in my shoulder. "I'm just exploring different ways to connect with my faith. New Hope has a really strong community outreach program that aligns with the work I do." "Community outreach," Dennis repeated with a slight snort. "What kind of community outreach?" "We run a food pantry every Saturday morning. I help coordinate donations and distribute meals to families in need. Last month we served over 300 people." "And what kind of people are these?" Carol asked, her eyebrows raised in a way that suggested she already knew the answer and didn't approve of. The question struck me as fundamentally wrong. The kind of attitude that Jesus himself had spoken against in the very scriptures we claim to follow. "People who are struggling," I said simply. "Families who lost jobs, elderly folks on fixed incomes, single parents trying to make ends meet, people who need help." "Well, I'm sure your intentions are good," Linda interjected, clearly trying to smooth over the growing tension. "It's wonderful that you want to help people." But Carol wasn't finished. "I just think you need to be careful about the kind of people you're associating with. Some folks are in difficult situations because of the choices they've made, and enabling them doesn't actually help anyone." The words hit me like a slap, though her hand hadn't moved from her tea glass. This was the woman who had taught me to memorize Bible verses about loving your neighbor, who had insisted I participate in every church charity drive and mission trip, who had raised me to believe that following Christ meant caring for the least among us. And now she was suggesting that the very people Jesus had specifically called us to serve were somehow unworthy of that service. "Mom, that's not how faith is supposed to work," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "We're called to help people without judging whether they deserve. That's literally the whole point of grace." Her eyes flashed with something between anger and hurt. "Don't lecture me about faith, young lady. I've been walking with the Lord longer than you've been alive." and I know the difference between true charity and throwing good resources after people who won't help themselves. So did Jesus make a mistake when he ate with tax collectors and prostitutes? I asked, the question coming out before I could stop it. Should he have been more selective about who deserved his time? The silence that followed was deafening. Frank cleared his throat and excused himself to check on something in the kitchen. Linda suddenly became very interested in the pattern on her dress. Dennis's face had taken on the red tinge that usually preceded one of his lectures about respect and proper behavior. Carol's lips formed a thin line, her hands gripping her tea glass so tightly I worried it might shatter. I cannot believe, she said slowly, that you would compare those people to our Lord and Savior. That is exactly the kind of twisted thinking that comes from these modern churches that care more about being politically correct than being biblically sound. I'm not comparing anyone to Jesus, I said, struggling to keep my voice calm. I'm trying to follow his example of showing love to everyone, regardless of their circumstances. Love, she repeated, as if the word itself were offensive. What you call love, I call naive. What you call compassion, I call enabling. And what you call following Jesus, I call picking and choosing the parts of Scripture that make you feel good while ignoring the parts about personal responsibility and righteous living.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The accusation stung because it was so fundamentally unfair. I had spent months studying Scripture, praying about my faith journey, seeking guidance from mentors I trusted. The decision to find a new church home hadn't been made lightly or out of rebellion, but out of a genuine desire to grow spiritually and serve others more effectively. That's not fair, Mom, I said quietly. You don't know what I believe or how I've arrived at these decisions. You've never even asked me about my spiritual journey or what I've been learning. Your spiritual journey, Dennis interjected from his chair, his voice carrying the weight of paternal authority. What you need to journey back to is some respect for the people who raised you and the church that shaped you. This whole conversation is exactly what's wrong with your generation. Everything has to be about your personal feelings, instead of honoring the wisdom of those who came before you. I felt something crack inside me, like a dam that had been holding back years of frustration finally giving way. Honoring wisdom is one thing, I said, my voice rising, despite my efforts to control it. But blindly accepting judgment and prejudice isn't wisdom, it's fear. Carol's tea glass hit the coffee table with a sharp crack, and she rose to her feet so quickly that Linda actually. Her face had gone pale except for 2 bright spots of color on her cheeks, and her hands trembled with what I realized was genuine rage. How dare you, she said, her voice low and dangerous. How dare you come into my home on Easter Sunday and accuse me of prejudice and fear? After everything your father and I have sacrificed for you, after all the values we've tried to instill, this is how you repay us, by throwing our love back in our faces and acting like you're somehow more enlightened than the people who raised you. The room felt like it was spinning. This had escalated far beyond what I'd intended, but I couldn't seem to find the brakes. I'm not throwing anything back at you, I said desperately. I'm just trying to live my faith in a way that feels authentic to me. Authentic, That's another one of those modern words that means nothing. What you call authentic, I call selfish. What you call following your heart, I call following the world instead of following God. Carol, Linda said softly, maybe we should all take a deep breath and remember that it's Easter. But Carol was beyond hearing gentle suggestions. She moved closer to where I was sitting, her presence suddenly feeling overwhelming and threatening in a way I'd never experienced from her before. You want to know what I think? She continued, her voice shaking with emotion. I think you've let the world convince you that your feelings matter more than God's truth. I think you've bought into the lie that loving people means accepting their sin instead of calling them to repentance. And I think you've become so prideful in your own understanding that you can't see how far you've fallen from the girl we raised. Each word felt like a physical blow, not just because of the anger behind them, but because of how completely they misrepresented everything I believed and everything I was trying to do with my life. The accusation of pride was particularly cruel, given that I'd spent months agonizing over whether I was making the right choices, seeking counsel, questioning my own motives at every turn. That's not who I am, I said, tears starting to blur my vision. I'm the same person I've always been. I'm just trying to grow and learn and serve God in the best way I know how. No, she said firmly, you're not the same person. The daughter I raised would never have spoken to her mother the way you just did. The daughter I raised understood respect and gratitude and humility. What you've become is someone who thinks she knows better than everyone else, someone who's too proud to admit when she's wrong. The word ungrateful hung unspoken in the air, but I could feel it coming. It was the ultimate weapon in her arsenal, the accusation that could reduce me to a guilty child no matter how old I became or how carefully I'd tried to live my life. I am grateful, I said quietly, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was supposed to be grateful for at this moment. I'm grateful for everything you and Dad have done for me, but that doesn't mean I have to agree with you about everything for the rest of my life. Grateful, she repeated, and there was something almost hysterical in her laugh. You think sitting in my living room, on Easter Sunday, arguing with me about everything I hold dear, telling me my faith is based on fear and prejudice, lecturing me about what Jesus would do, you think that's gratitude? I think having an honest conversation about faith is different from attacking your faith, I said, though even as I spoke I could hear how the distinction might be lost in the heat of the moment. Honest conversation, she said, shaking her head. Is that what you call it when you come here and tell me that the church that raised you, the community that supported you, the values we've lived by for decades are all wrong, when you imply that we're hypocrites and you're somehow more Christ-like than we? I realized with growing horror that this conversation had spun completely out of control, that somewhere in the midst of defending my choices, I had indeed sounded condescending and dismissive of beliefs that meant everything to her. But I also realized that any attempt to backtrack now would be seen as insincere, or worse, as proof that I was indeed prideful and rebellious. Mom, that's not what I meant, I said, reaching out toward her. I never said you were wrong. I was just trying to explain why I've made different choices. But she stepped back from my outstretched hand as if it might burn her. Different choices, she repeated. You mean better choices, superior choices that prove you've outgrown the simple faith of simple people like your parents. The hurt in her voice was genuine and deep, and I felt a stab of guilt so sharp it took my breath away. This was my mother, the woman who had sung me to sleep and bandaged my scraped knees and celebrated every small victory in my life. The woman who had worked double shifts to help pay for my college education and had cried with pride at my graduation. The woman who had raised me to believe that I could do anything, be anything, make a difference in the world. And somehow in trying to do exactly that, I had made her feel small and dismissed, and unloved. That's not what I think, I said desperately. Mom, please, you're misunderstanding me. Am I? She asked, and her voice was suddenly very quiet, very controlled. Then tell me, Brooke, tell me exactly what you think of your mother who's too judgmental to work with homeless people. Tell me what you think of your father who's too simple to understand modern faith. Tell me what you think of the church that's too backward to meet your sophisticated spiritual needs. The trap was perfect and complete. Any answer I gave would either be a lie or a confirmation of her worst fears about what I'd become. I could feel Frank and Linda watching from the kitchen doorway, could sense Dennis leaning forward in his chair, could feel the weight of a moment that would define our relationship for years to come. I think, I said carefully, that we're all trying to follow God the best way we know how. And sometimes that means we make different choices, but that doesn't make any of us wrong or right or better than anyone else. It was a diplomatic answer, a careful answer, an answer designed to diffuse rather than defend. But it was also, I realized as soon as I said it, an answer that satisfied no one, least of all myself. Carol stared at me for a long moment, her eyes searching my face as if she were looking for some trace of the daughter she recognized. Then, without warning, her hand flew through the air and connected with my cheek with a crack that echoed through the suddenly silent room. The slap wasn't particularly hard, but the shock of it sent me reeling backward into the couch. I raised my hand to my stinging cheek, staring at her in complete disbelief. In 25 years of life, through all the arguments and disagreements and teenage rebellions, she had never once raised a hand to me. That, she said, her voice shaking with rage, is for being an ungrateful, disrespectful child who thinks she's too good for the family that raised her. The room was completely silent, except for the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Linda had covered her mouth with her hand. Frank was staring at the floor. Dennis looked as shocked as I felt, his mouth hanging slightly open. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. The side of my face burned where her hand had connected, but that pain was nothing compared to the ache in my chest. This woman who had taught me about love and forgiveness, and turning the other cheek, had just struck me for having different opinions about how to live out the faith she'd raised me in. I think, I said quietly, my voice surprisingly steady, I should go. Yes, Carol said, her chin raised defiantly, I think you should. I walked to the dining room table and picked up the chocolate cake I'd brought, the dessert that was supposed to be my contribution to a family celebration that had instead become a declaration of war. My hands were shaking as I lifted it, and for a moment I considered leaving it behind, letting it serve as some kind of peace offering or apology. But then I realized that would be just another way of accepting blame for something that wasn't entirely my fault, another way of smoothing over conflict by taking responsibility for everyone else's feelings. "Happy Easter, Mom," I said, and walked toward the door. Behind me I heard Linda's voice, soft and pleading. "Carol, honey, maybe you should call her back." But Carol's response was firm and final. "She knows where we live when she's ready to apologize for the way she's behaved." I drove the 40 minutes back to Nashville with tears streaming down my face and my cheek still burning from her slap. The dogwood petals that had looked so festive that morning now seemed like sad remnants of a celebration that had died before it could begin. By the time I reached my apartment, the sun was setting and Easter was nearly over. I sat in my car for a long time in the parking lot, staring up at the windows of my small but comfortable home. Inside was a life I'd built for myself, work that gave me purpose, friends who supported my choices, a church community that welcomed questions and doubts and different perspectives. It was a good life, a life I was proud of, so why did I feel like I'd just lost everything that mattered? I woke up the next morning with the taste of regret thick in my mouth and Carol's handprint still echoing across my cheek. The apartment felt different somehow, like the walls had shifted overnight to accommodate the weight of what had happened. Sunlight streamed through my bedroom window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air with the kind of careless freedom I envied. My phone sat silent on the nightstand, its dark screen reflecting my own hollow expression. Part of me had expected it to be buzzing with messages, calls, some kind of acknowledgement that yesterday had been a catastrophe requiring immediate attention. Instead there was nothing. The silence felt deliberate, calculated, like a punishment designed to make me feel the full weight of my supposed transgression. I padded to the kitchen in my pajamas, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. The chocolate cake sat on my counter like evidence of a crime, its perfect frosting now somehow mocking in the morning light. I'd carried it home like a shield, but now it just reminded me of how quickly celebration can turn to devastation. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the quiet apartment with sounds of normalcy. I stood at my kitchen window, looking out at the parking lot where my neighbors were beginning their Tuesday routines. Mrs. Chen from downstairs was loading her car with real estate signs. The college student next door was hurrying to class with a backpack slung over his shoulder. Life was continuing as if nothing had changed, as if my entire relationship with my family hadn't imploded over Sunday dinner. My phone buzzed against the granite countertop, and my heart leaped with a mixture of hope and dread. Maybe Carol had realized how out of line she'd been. Maybe Dennis had convinced her to call and apologize. Maybe Linda had intervened with some kind of peacemaking gesture. Instead it was a text from Paige Winters, my closest friend from work. "How was Easter? You look like you could use coffee and conversation." Paige had an uncanny ability to sense when something was wrong, even from a distance. We'd met during my first week at the nonprofit when she'd found me crying in the supply closet, after a particularly difficult case involving a family with 3 young children. She'd handed me tissues without asking questions, then taken me out for the kind of greasy comfort food that somehow makes everything slightly more bearable. I texted back, "Definitely need both. Free for lunch? Always free for you. Usual place at..." The usual place was a small cafe called Grounds for Hope, tucked between a vintage bookstore and a yoga studio in the artsy part of downtown Nashville. Paige had discovered it during her first month in the city, and it had become our unofficial therapy session location. The owner, Marcus, made coffee strong enough to wake the dead and sandwiches big enough to feed a small army. I spent the morning trying to distract myself with household chores, but every task reminded me of something Carol had taught me. Folding laundry brought back memories of her showing me how to get perfect creases in dress shirts. Washing dishes reminded me of standing beside her at the kitchen sink, learning the proper way to clean crystal glasses without leaving water spots. Even making my bed carried echoes of her voice explaining why hospital corners were the only acceptable way to tuck sheets. By 11:30 I was dressed and driving through Nashville traffic that seemed unusually aggressive for a Tuesday. Every red light felt personal, every slow driver an intentional obstacle between me and the conversation I desperately needed to have. When I finally pulled into the parking lot behind Grounds for Hope, my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. Paige was already waiting at our usual table in the corner, a steaming mug of coffee in front of her and another one waiting for me. She looked up as I approached, and her expression immediately shifted from casual greeting to concerned friend. Paige had perfected the art of reading faces during her years as a counselor before joining the nonprofit world, and apparently my face was an open book written in a language she spoke fluently. "Okay," she said without preamble as I slid into the chair across from her. "Tell me who I need to help you hide the body of." Despite everything, I almost smiled. "It's that obvious? Honey, you look like you've been hit by a truck. A truck driven by someone you trusted." She paused, studying my face more carefully. "Actually, you look like you've been literally hit. Is that a bruise on your cheek?" My hand flew instinctively to the spot where Carol's palm had connected. I'd tried to cover it with concealer that morning, but apparently I hadn't been entirely successful. "It's a long story. I've got time and Marcus makes really good pie. Start talking." So I did. I told her about the conversation that had spiraled out of control, about the accusations and counter-accusations, about the moment when everything I thought I knew about my mother crumbled into dust. I told her about the slap that still echoed in my dreams, about the drive home through the darkness, about waking up to silence that felt like exile. Paige listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and whistled softly. "Your mother slapped you for having different religious views? For being ungrateful and disrespectful, according to her. By doing what, exactly? Volunteering at a food pantry, attending a different church, having opinions about how to live your faith." When she put it like that, the whole thing sounded even more absurd. She thinks I've become prideful and judgmental. She thinks I look down on her and Dad and their beliefs. And do you? The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on defending myself against Carol's accusations that I hadn't really examined whether there might be truth in them. Did I look down on my parents' faith? Did I think my approach to Christianity was somehow superior to theirs? "I don't think so," I said slowly. "I mean, I disagree with some of their attitudes, but I don't think that makes me better than them. I just think there are different ways to follow Christ, and mine looks different from theirs, and that's worth being disowned over." Apparently, Paige leaned forward, her elbows on the table. "Brooke, I need you to hear me on this. What happened yesterday wasn't about theology or church attendance or volunteer work. It was about control. Your mother expected you to continue being the compliant daughter who never questions anything, and when you showed signs of independent thinking, she panicked. But I wasn't trying to rebel against them. I was just trying to be honest about where I am spiritually, which is exactly what healthy adults do." The fact that she responded with violence tells you everything you need to know about how healthy this relationship actually is. The word violence made me flinch. It wasn't really violence, it was just a slap. A slap is violence, bro. Physical violence used to punish you for having different opinions. That's not normal family conflict. That's abuse. I stared down at my coffee mug, watching the cream swirl in patterns that reminded me of storm clouds. The word abuse felt too big, too serious, too dramatic for what had happened. Abuse was what happened to other people. People in obviously dysfunctional families. People whose parents were clearly monsters. My parents were respected members of their community, church leaders, people who had raised me to believe in right and wrong and the importance of family. "I don't know if I'd call it abuse," I said quietly. "What would you call it when a parent hits their adult child for expressing different religious views?" I didn't have an answer for that, which was probably an answer in itself. Marcus appeared at our table with 2 plates of his famous turkey and avocado sandwiches, along with a slice of chocolate pie that looked like it could solve most of the world's problems. He took one look at my face and set down an extra napkin without saying anything. Marcus had seen enough broken hearts in his cafe to recognize one at first glance. "So what happens now?" Paige asked after we'd eaten in companionable silence for a few minutes. "I don't know. I keep thinking I should call and apologize, try to smooth things over. Apologize for upsetting her, for being disrespectful, for ruining Easter. You mean for having opinions and expressing them honestly when directly asked?" When she put it that way, it sounded ridiculous, but the guilt was still there, heavy and familiar, whispering that I should have known better, should have kept my mouth shut, should have found a way to avoid conflict even if it meant being dishonest about my beliefs. "She's my mother, Paige. I love her. I don't want to be estranged from my family. I understand that, but love doesn't mean accepting mistreatment, and estrangement isn't something you're doing to them. It's something they're doing to you by making your relationship conditional on your compliance." We finished lunch and parted ways in the parking lot with a hug that lasted longer than usual. As I drove back to my apartment, Paige's words echoed in my mind like a song I couldn't quite shake. Was this really about control? Was I really being abused? Or was I just being overly sensitive about normal family friction? The afternoon stretched ahead of me like a desert. I had tomorrow off work, which meant 36 hours of solitude to replay every moment of yesterday's disaster. I tried reading, but the words blurred together, I tried watching television, but every show seemed to feature happy families resolving their conflicts with love and understanding. I tried cleaning my apartment, but everything was already spotless. By evening, the silence had become unbearable. I found myself reaching for my phone half a dozen times, my finger hovering over Carol's contact information. Each time I stopped myself, remembering the look in her eyes when she'd told me I knew where to find them when I was ready to apologize. But what exactly was I supposed to apologize for? At 9 o'clock, my phone finally buzzed with an incoming call. For a wild moment, my heart leaped with the hope that it might be Carol or Dennis, calling to say they'd been thinking about what happened, that they wanted to work things out. Instead, it was Kyle Hamilton, my cousin and the only member of my extended family who had ever really understood me. Kyle was Uncle Frank's son, 2 years older than me and blessed with the kind of emotional intelligence that made him everyone's favorite confidant. He'd been away at a work conference during Easter, which explained his absence from yesterday's festivities. "Brooke," he said without preamble, "what the hell happened at Easter dinner? You heard about it? Mom called me this morning. She's worried sick about you. She said Aunt Carol lost her mind and actually hit you." The concern in his voice almost undid me. Kyle had been like a big brother to me growing up, the person I called when I needed advice about everything from college majors to relationship drama. Hearing his familiar voice felt like being thrown a lifeline. "It wasn't that simple," I said, though even as I spoke I wasn't sure why I was defending her. "She hit you, Brooke, over a conversation about church. How is that complicated?" So I told him the whole story, from the beginning including all the parts I'd left out when talking to Paige. I told him about my doubts, about my new church, about the conversation that had spiraled so quickly out of control. I told him about feeling guilty and confused, and completely lost. Kyle listened without judgment, asking occasional questions but mostly just letting me talk. When I finished, he was quiet for so long I wondered if we'd been disconnected. "Kyle, I'm here. I'm just trying to process all this. Brooke, you know I love Aunt Carol and Uncle Dennis, but what you're describing sounds like they've lost their damn minds. I keep wondering if I handled it wrong, if I was too confrontational, too stubborn. From what you've told me, you expressed your opinions when asked, and tried to explain your choices when challenged. That's not confrontational, that's honest. The fact that they couldn't handle honesty says more about them than it does about you. But she's right about one thing. I have changed. I do see some things differently than I used to." "Of course you have. You're 25 years old. You're supposed to grow and change and develop your own perspectives. That's what healthy adults do." "Then why do I feel so guilty?" "Because they raised you to feel guilty anytime you don't meet their expectations. That guilt isn't coming from God, Brooke. It's coming from years of emotional conditioning." The phrase emotional conditioning sent a chill down my spine. It sounded clinical, manipulative, like something that happened in dysfunctional families. Not in mine. "I don't want to lose them, Kyle. You haven't lost them. They've chosen to create distance because you won't pretend to be someone you're not. That's their choice, not yours." After we hung up, I sat in my living room staring at the wall where I'd hung a cross-stitch sampler Carol had made for my college graduation. It read, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart," in careful script surrounded by tiny flowers. She'd spent weeks working on it, her fingers cramped from the delicate needlework, her eyes strained from the close attention to detail. Now it felt like a relic from a different life, a time when trusting in the Lord had meant trusting in my parents' interpretation of what that looked like. Wednesday morning arrived gray and rainy, matching my mood perfectly. I forced myself to get dressed and go grocery shopping, partly because I needed food and partly because I needed to prove to myself that I could still function like a normal human being. The Kroger on West End was busy with the usual mix of young professionals and college students, everyone moving with the purposeful efficiency of people who had places to be and things to accomplish. I wandered the aisles with my cart, picking up items I didn't really need, trying to make the trip last as long as possible. In the cereal aisle I ran into Dorothy Evans, one of the older women from First Baptist Church. Miss Evans had taught my Sunday school class when I was 12 and had always been kind to me, the type of church lady who remembered everyone's birthday and showed up with casseroles whenever someone was sick. "Brooke, honey," she called out, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "How wonderful to see you. I was just thinking about you the other day." My stomach dropped. Had Carol already started spreading her version of what happened? Was Mrs. Evans about to deliver some kind of message or lecture disguised as friendly conversation? "Hi, Mrs. Evans," I said cautiously. "How are you doing?" "Oh, I'm fine, dear. Getting older but still kicking. Listen, I wanted to thank you for that care package you sent to my sister in Memphis last month. The one with all the homemade soup and the prayer shawl. It meant the world to her during her recovery." I stared at her blankly for a moment, before remembering. Her sister had been battling cancer, and I'd organized a care package through my new church's outreach ministry. I'd completely forgotten that Mrs. Evans was related to the recipient. "Oh, that was nothing," I said. "I was happy to help." "Nothing?" she laughed, a warm sound that filled the cereal aisle. "Honey, you coordinated donations from people you'd never met, spent your own Saturday morning making soup, and drove 2 hours to Memphis to deliver it personally. That's not nothing, that's love in action." Her words hit me like a physical blow. Here was evidence of exactly the kind of Christian service I'd been trying to defend to Carol, and it was coming from someone who had known me since childhood, someone who had seen me grow up in the very church my mother thought I'd abandoned. "Miss Evans," I said carefully, "has my mother mentioned anything to you about me lately?" Her expression grew puzzled. "Your mother? No, why? Is everything all right?" So the news hadn't spread yet. Carol hadn't started her campaign to turn the church against me. Yet, everything's fine, I lied. "I just wondered if she'd told you about my new church." "New church?" Mrs. Evans looked genuinely surprised. "You're not attending First Baptist anymore?" I braced myself for judgment, for disappointment, for the kind of gentle but firm correction that church ladies excelled at delivering. Instead, her expression grew thoughtful. "Well, that's interesting," she said. "What led you to make that change?" Her tone was curious rather than accusatory, open rather than defensive. I found myself explaining about New Hope Community Church, about the contemporary worship style, about the community outreach programs that had captured my heart. Mrs. Evans listened with the kind of attention that made me feel heard, rather than judged. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "It sounds like you found a place where you can use your gifts effectively," she said. "That's wonderful, dear. The Lord works through many different churches." The acceptance in her voice almost brought me to tears. This was the kind of response I'd hoped for from Carol, the kind of blessing and support that should have come from my own mother. "Mrs. Evans," I said impulsively, "do you think it's wrong to question things you were taught growing up, to develop different perspectives as you get old?" She was quiet for a moment, studying my face with the wisdom of someone who had raised 4 children and guided countless young people through spiritual crises. "Brooke, honey," she said finally, "faith that can't withstand questions isn't faith at all. It's just tradition dressed up in pretty clothes. The Lord gave you a mind for a reason. He expects you to use it." I left the grocery store with more than just food. I carried with me the radical idea that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't done anything wrong by growing and changing and seeking a deeper understanding of my faith. But that afternoon, my phone rang with a call that would change everything. "Miss Hamilton?" The voice was male, formal, with the carefully neutral tone of someone delivering official information. "This is Pastor Raymond Clark, from First Baptist Church of Millbrook. I believe we need to have a conversation." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Pastor Clark had been a figure of authority in my life since middle school, the man who had confirmed my faith, who had counseled me through teenage doubts, who had blessed my college plans and celebrated my graduation. He wasn't someone who called for casual conversation. "Pastor Clark," I managed to say, "what can I do for you?" "I think you know why I'm calling, Brooke. Your mother came to see me this morning. She's very concerned about some changes in your spiritual life, and frankly, so am I." The words felt like a trap closing around me. Carol had gone to Pastor Clark. She had made this a church matter, involving the spiritual authority who had shaped my faith journey from childhood. This was no longer just a family argument. This was a battle for the very foundation of who I was. "I see," I said carefully. "And what exactly did she tell you?" "She told me that you've abandoned the church that raised you, that you've embraced some kind of progressive theology that puts feelings above scripture, and that you've become disrespectful and rebellious toward your parents. She's worried about the state of your soul, Brooke." And after hearing what she had to say, "I'm worried too." Each accusation felt like a dagger between my ribs. This was Carol's version of events, filtered through tears and righteous indignation, presented to a man who had known me since childhood, but hadn't seen me regularly in over a year. "Pastor Clark, I think there's been some misunderstanding." "Has there?" he interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of pastoral authority. "Because what I'm hearing is that you've rejected the biblical teaching you received growing up, and embraced a more worldly approach to faith. Is that accurate?" The question was loaded with assumptions, phrased in a way that made any answer sound like a confession. If I said yes, I was admitting to apostasy. If I said no, I was calling Carol a liar. "I haven't rejected biblical teaching," I said slowly. "I've found a church community that interprets some things differently than First Baptist does." "Interprets things differently," he repeated, and I could hear the skepticism in his voice. "Brooke, there's only one way to interpret God's word, and that's with reverence and submission to its authority. When we start deciding for ourselves what Scripture means, we put ourselves in the place of God." "But Pastor Clark, Don't different denominations interpret things differently? Don't even scholars within the same tradition sometimes disagree about interpretation? Some things are open to scholarly debate, he conceded. But the fundamental truths of the faith are clear and unchanging, and from what your mother tells me, you've strayed far from those fundamentals. I felt like I was drowning in quicksand, every attempt to explain myself only pulling me deeper into a conversation I couldn't win. Pastor Clark had already made up his mind based on Carol's version of events, and anything I said would be filtered through that predetermined narrative. What would you like me to do? I asked finally. I'd like you to come home, he said, his voice softening slightly. I'd like you to sit down with me and your parents and work through this spiritual crisis you're experiencing. I'd like to help you find your way back to the truth you were raised in. The word home was particularly cruel, implying that I was somehow lost or displaced, that my current life and faith community were temporary wayward wanderings rather than genuine choices. And if I don't want to do that, the silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice had returned to its formal pastoral tone. Then I'm afraid you'll have to live with the consequences of that choice, Brooke. Your mother is heartbroken. Your father is deeply disappointed. The church community that raised you is concerned about your spiritual welfare. Rebellion against godly authority always comes with a price. After he hung up, I sat in my apartment staring at my phone as if it might explode. Pastor Clark had just delivered what amounted to an ultimatum disguised as pastoral concern: submit to their interpretation of my spiritual life or face the consequences of community disapproval and family estrangement. But for the first time since Easter Sunday, I felt something other than guilt and confusion. I felt angry. How dare Carol drag our family conflict into the church? How dare she present her version of events as objective truth without giving me a chance to respond? How dare Pastor Clark call and deliver judgment without hearing my side of the story? Most importantly, how dare any of them claim to speak for God while demonstrating so little of the grace and love that Jesus himself had shown to people who disagreed with religious authorities? I thought about Mrs. Evans in the cereal aisle accepting my choices with warmth and wisdom. I thought about my new church community, where questions were welcomed and different perspectives were valued. I thought about the homeless families I worked with every day, people who had been judged and dismissed by others but who showed more genuine faith than some of the most religiously correct people I knew. And I made a decision that would change everything. If they wanted a war, they were going to get one. But this time, I wasn't going to fight with guilt and apologies and desperate attempts to maintain peace at any cost. This time, I was going to fight with truth. The decision crystallized in my mind like ice forming on a window. I wasn't going to apologize for having opinions. I wasn't going to beg for acceptance from people who had already decided I was beyond redemption. And I certainly wasn't going to let Pastor Clark or anyone else speak for God in condemning choices they didn't understand. Thursday morning found me at New Hope Community Church an hour before the weekly staff meeting, sitting in Pastor Miller's office with 2 cups of coffee and a story that needed telling. Pastor Rebecca Miller was everything Pastor Clark wasn't. Approachable, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in hearing all sides of a situation before forming opinion. She was also a woman, which had initially scandalized Carol when I mentioned it during one of our earlier conversations about my church attendance. So let me make sure I understand this correctly, Pastor Miller said after I'd finished explaining the situation. Her gray hair caught the morning sunlight streaming through her office window, and her expression was one of concern rather than judgment. Your family is upset because you've chosen to worship here, and now your former pastor is pressuring you to return to what he considers proper faith. That's the simplified version, yes. And your mother physically struck you during this conversation? I nodded, touching my cheek unconsciously. The bruise had faded, but the memory remained sharp and clear. Pastor Miller leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her face. Brooke, I want you to know that nothing you've told me suggests you've done anything wrong. Spiritual growth often means asking difficult questions and sometimes finding different answers than the ones we were given as children. But what if they're right? What if I have become prideful? What if I'm just rebelling against authority because it's easier than submitting? Do you feel prideful when you serve at the food pantry? When you help coordinate care packages for cancer patients? When you work with homeless families at your job? No, I admit. I feel grateful to be able to help. Then I think we can safely say your spiritual journey isn't motivated by pride. It sounds like it's motivated by a genuine desire to serve others and grow closer to God. She paused, studying my face carefully. What do you want to do about this situation with your family and former church? It was the first time anyone had asked me what I wanted rather than telling me what I should do. The question felt revolutionary, like being given permission to have desires and make choices based on my own understanding rather than other people's expectations. I want them to stop trying to control me. I want them to respect that I'm an adult who can make her own spiritual decisions. And I want them to stop claiming that disagreeing with them is the same as disagreeing with God. Those sound like reasonable wants to me. The question is, how do you plan to communicate that to them? I had been thinking about this since Pastor Clark's call, turning different approaches over in my mind like stones in my palm. I think I need to write them a letter, something clear and direct that explains my position without getting caught up in emotional arguments. That sounds wise. Would you like help drafting it? Pastor Miller's offer surprised me. I had expected spiritual counsel, perhaps some Bible verses about honoring parents or maintaining family relationships. I hadn't expected practical assistance in what amounted to a declaration of independence. You'd help me with that, Brooke. Part of my job is helping people navigate difficult relationships while staying true to their faith. If writing a letter will help you communicate clearly and maintain your integrity, then I'm absolutely willing to help. We spent the next hour crafting what amounted to my spiritual manifesto. The letter was respectful but firm, acknowledging my love for my family while refusing to apologize for choices I believed were right. It explained my current faith community, my reasons for being there, and my desire to maintain family relationships without sacrificing my autonomy. Most importantly, it addressed Pastor Clark's ultimatum directly, making it clear that I would not be returning to First Baptist under duress and that any future relationship with my home church would need to be based on mutual respect rather than submission to pressure. By the time I left Pastor Miller's office, I felt lighter somehow, as if I'd set down a burden I'd been carrying without realizing its weight. The letter was printed and sealed in an envelope addressed to Carol and Dennis Hamilton, with copies prepared for Pastor Clark and anyone else who might need to understand my position. But before I could mail it, the situation escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. Friday afternoon, I was at work reviewing case files when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Your parents are asking everyone to pray for your rebellious heart at Sunday service. Thought you should know. A friend. My hands began shaking as I read the message. Carol hadn't just involved Pastor Clark in our family drama. She was making it a public spectacle, asking the entire congregation to participate in what amounted to a spiritual intervention conducted from the pulpit. I immediately called Kyle, who answered on the second ring. Please tell me you haven't heard anything about Sunday's service at First Baptist, I said without preamble. Oh honey, he sighed, and I could hear the regret in his voice. Mom called me an hour ago. Apparently Aunt Carol asked Pastor Clark to include you in the prayer requests this week. She's telling people you've fallen away from the faith and need the congregation's prayers to find your way back to God. The room seemed to spin around me. She's making it sound like I'm some kind of prodigal daughter who's lost her way. That's exactly how she's making it sound. And from what Mom says, Pastor Clark is going along with it. They're presenting it as a family in crisis, asking for the church's support in bringing their wayward child back to the fold. I closed my office door and sank into my chair, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just family conflict anymore. This was public humiliation designed to pressure me into compliance through community shame. Kyle, they're not just disagreeing with my choices. They're actively trying to destroy my reputation in the community where I grew up. I know, and it's not right, Brooke. Even if they genuinely believe you've made wrong choices, this isn't the way to handle it. After hanging up with Kyle, I sat in my office staring at the sealed letter on my desk. It had seemed like such a reasonable approach just hours ago, a calm, mature response to an emotional situation. Now it felt completely inadequate in the face of what amounted to a public relations campaign, designed to paint me as a rebellious child in need of community intervention. That evening, Paige came over with Thai takeout and moral support. We spread the cartons of food across my coffee table and ate while I filled her in on the latest developments. They're going to pray for you in church, she said, her chopsticks paused halfway to her mouth. Like you're some kind of missionary in a dangerous foreign country. Worse, like I'm a backslider who's abandoned her faith and needs to be rescued from the forces of evil. Which forces of evil would those be? The food pantry, the homeless shelter, the church where people are encouraged to think for themselves. When she put it that way, the whole situation sounded even more absurd. But absurd or not, it was happening, and I needed to figure out how to respond. I can't just let them control the narrative. If I stay silent, everyone in Millbrook is going to believe I really have become some kind of rebellious apostate. So don't stay silent, tell your side of the story. How? Show up at church on Sunday and interrupt the prayer request. Write a letter to the editor of the local paper. Start my own whisper campaign. Or, Paige said thoughtfully, you could show them what your actual faith looks like instead of trying to defend it with words. The idea intrigued me, though I wasn't entirely sure what she meant. How do you? Well, they're claiming you've abandoned Christian values, right? So prove them wrong. Show the community what your faith actually produces. Show them the work you're doing, the people you're helping, the love you're putting into the world. You mean like a demonstration? I mean like living your faith so visibly and authentically that their accusations become obviously false to anyone paying attention. The more I thought about Paige's suggestion, the more sense it made. Instead of getting dragged into theological debates or family drama, I could simply let my actions speak for themselves. If Carol wanted to make this a public matter, then the public could see for themselves what my supposedly wayward faith actually looked like in practice. Saturday morning I drove back to Millbrook with a car full of supplies and a plan that felt both terrifying and exactly right. I had spent Friday evening coordinating with New Hope's outreach ministry, organizing what we were calling a community care day in the downtown area near First Baptist Church. The plan was simple: set up tables with free food, clothing, and basic necessities for anyone who needed them. No sermons, no conditions, no requirements other than human need. Just the kind of radical hospitality that Jesus himself had practiced, offered without judgment or expectation of conversion. I arrived at the small park across from the church at 8 in the morning, 2 hours before First Baptist's 11 o'clock service would begin. Marcus from Grounds for Hope had donated coffee and pastries. Several members of New Hope had driven down to help distribute clothing and hygiene items. Dr. Sarah Jenkins, a physician from our congregation, had even arranged to provide free basic health screenings. By 9:30, word had spread through the community and people were beginning to gather. Miss Patterson, an elderly woman whose husband had died the previous year, came looking for someone to talk to about her loneliness. Tommy Richardson, a veteran struggling with PTSD and unemployment, needed help finding resources for job training. The Martinez family, who had recently lost their home due to medical bills, came looking for clothing for their 3 young children. Each person who approached our tables was greeted with warmth and respect, offered whatever help we could provide, and treated as a valued human being rather than a charity case. No one asked about their church attendance or their personal choices. No one offered unsolicited advice about how they should be living their lives. We simply tried to meet their immediate needs with kindness and dignity. As 10:30 approached and First Baptist members began arriving for the service, I could see people pointing and whispering. Some looked curious, others confused, a few openly hostile, but several people stopped to see what we were doing, and more than one church member quietly asked if they could help. Miss Evans approached our food table around 10:45, wearing her Sunday best but walking with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission. "Brooke Hamilton," she said, loud enough for several nearby people to hear, "what on earth are you doing out here?" For a moment I panicked, wondering if she was about to deliver some kind of public rebuke on behalf of the church. Instead, she looked around at the tables full of supplies, the volunteers helping families find what they needed, the general atmosphere of organized compassion, and smiled. "This is beautiful, honey," she said more quietly. "This is exactly what the church should be doing. We're just trying to help people," I said. "No," she corrected me gently. "You're loving people the way Jesus did. There's a difference." She stayed to help distribute food until the church service was about to start, then pressed a $20 bill into my hand for supplies before hurrying inside. At exactly 11 o'clock, as the opening hymn began drifting across the street from First Baptist Sanctuary, our little operation reached its peak activity. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my former church family was inside praying for my wayward soul, I was outside actually doing the work they claimed I had abandoned. Carol emerged from the church around noon, immediately after the service ended. I saw her before she saw me, standing on the front steps talking animatedly with Pastor Clark and several other church members. She was clearly explaining something urgent, her hands gesturing in my direction. Then she spotted me behind the food table, wearing a New Hope Community Church t-shirt and handing out sandwiches to anyone who wanted them. Her face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, anger, and finally something that looked almost like fear. She marched across the street with Pastor Clark and 2 deacons in tow, her Sunday heels clicking against the asphalt with military precision. The small crowd around our tables seemed to sense the approaching confrontation and grew quiet. "What?" Carol demanded when she reached the edge of our setup. "Do you think you're doing?" "Feeding people," I replied calmly, continuing to wrap sandwiches in napkins. "Would you like one?" "Don't be smart with me, bro. You're causing a scene, embarrassing yourself and your family in front of the entire community." Pastor Clark stepped forward, his expression grave with pastoral authority. "This is highly inappropriate, bro. Setting up some kind of protest directly across from the church, while your spiritual welfare is being discussed inside." "Protest?" I looked around at the families gathering supplies, the volunteers offering help, the general atmosphere of people caring for other people. "This isn't a protest. This is service." "Service?" Carol repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think showing off in front of everyone is service? I think meeting people's needs without judging whether they deserve help is service." I replied, "Isn't that what we're supposed to be doing as Christians?" One of the deacons, Mr. Thompson, whom I'd known since childhood, cleared his throat. "Now, Brooke, we appreciate charitable works, but there are proper channels for this kind of thing. The church has established ministries for helping the needy, and yet here are needy people who aren't being helped by those established ministries." I said, gesturing to Tommy Richardson, who was sitting at one of our tables talking with Dr. Jenkins about resources for veterans. "Because they won't help themselves," Carol said. "Because they're looking for handouts instead of taking responsibility for their situations." Her words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, and I could see several people within earshot turning to stare. Miss Martinez, who was helping her children pick out warm jackets, looked up with an expression of hurt and confusion. "Mom," I said quietly, "these people aren't statistics or moral lessons. They're human beings with names and stories and dignity. Human beings who need to hear the truth about sin and redemption, not just get free handouts that enable their poor choices." The conversation was attracting attention from both sides of the street. Church members lingered on the steps, clearly listening to what was becoming a very public theological debate. Community members who had come for help stood frozen, uncertain whether they were welcome or whether they were somehow causing family conflict. Pastor Miller chose that moment to arrive with another carload of supplies from Nashville. She took one look at the tense standoff and immediately moved to defuse the situation. "Good afternoon," she said pleasantly, extending her hand to Pastor Clark. "I'm Rebecca Miller from New Hope Community Church. You must be Pastor Clark. I've heard wonderful things about your ministry here." Pastor Clark looked taken aback, clearly not expecting such a cordial greeting from what he probably considered enemy territory. "Pastor Miller," he said stiffly, shaking her hand with obvious reluctance, "I wasn't aware that Nashville churches were expanding their ministries to Millbrook." "Oh, we're not expanding anything," she replied with a smile. "Brooke organized this community care day, and several of our members were happy to support her vision. It's been wonderful to see people from different backgrounds coming together to help their neighbors." "Different backgrounds," Carol interjected, "including people who've abandoned their home churches and their families for more fashionable forms of Christianity." Pastor Miller's expression didn't change, but I caught a slight tightening around her eye. "I'm sorry, I don't think we've been introduced. I'm Rebecca, Carol Hamilton, Brooke's mother, the one who's been praying for her daughter's return to proper faith, while her daughter sets up publicity stunts to embarrass her family." "Miss Hamilton," Pastor Miller said gently, "I understand family disagreements about faith can be painful, but what I see here today is a young woman living out her Christian calling by serving others without expectation of return. That doesn't look like rebellion to me. It looks like discipleship." The word discipleship seemed to hit Pastor Clark like a challenge. True discipleship involves submission to proper spiritual authority and sound doctrine, not freelancing whatever feels good at the moment. "And yet," Pastor Miller replied, her voice still pleasant but with an edge of steel, "Jesus himself was accused of freelancing by the religious authorities of his day. He fed people without requiring them to join his synagogue. He healed people regardless of their theology. He showed love to those whom respectable religious leaders considered unworthy." Several people in the growing crowd murmured agreement, and I could see Carol's face growing redder by the moment. "Are you comparing my daughter to Jesus Christ?" she demanded. I'm suggesting that following Jesus sometimes looks different from following religious tradition, Pastor Miller replied. And from what I've observed today, your daughter is doing exactly what Christ called his followers to do, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, caring for those in need. Without any regard for their spiritual condition, Pastor Clark added, without calling them to repentance or challenging them to change their lives. With regard for their humanity, I said, finally finding my voice again. With recognition that people are more likely to hear about God's love after they've experienced it through human kindness. That's not how salvation works, Brooke, Carol said sharply. People need to acknowledge their sin and turn to Christ for forgiveness. They don't need more excuses to avoid taking responsibility for their choices. Mrs. Martinez, who had been listening to this entire exchange while helping her children try on donated shoes, suddenly stood up. She was a small woman, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of tired eyes that come from working multiple jobs and still struggling to make ends meet. Excuse me, she said, her voice quiet but clear. I don't mean to interrupt, but I think you should know that your daughter has been nothing but kind to my family today. She didn't ask us why we needed help or whether we deserved it. She just offered food and clothing, and treated my children like they mattered. Carol looked uncomfortable, clearly not expecting to be directly addressed by one of the people we were helping. I'm sure she means well, Carol said stiffly. But my husband died in a car accident 6 months ago. Mrs. Martinez continued, her voice growing strong. We lost our house because I couldn't afford the mortgage on my income alone. We've been staying with relatives and trying to get back on our feet. Today is the first time in months that someone has offered help without making us feel ashamed for needing. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Several church members who had been watching from the steps were now actively approaching to see what we were doing, drawn by Ms. Martinez's testimony and the obvious tension between their pastor and this unexpected ministry happening in their front yard. Pastor Clark seemed to realize that the situation was spiraling beyond his control. Ms. Hamilton, he said to Carol, perhaps we should continue this conversation privately. But Carol wasn't finished. The public nature of the confrontation seemed to have triggered something in her. Some need to justify herself in front of the community that had known her for decades. I want everyone here to understand, she announced, her voice carrying across both sides of the street, that my daughter has abandoned the church that raised her, rejected the values her father and I taught her, and chosen to follow teachers who care more about social work than salvation. The accusation hung in the air like an indictment, delivered with the kind of righteous certainty that brooks no argument. But instead of the murmurs of agreement she probably expected, the response was largely silence punctuated by uncomfortable shifting and exchanged glances. Because by this point, word had spread through the community, and people could see for themselves what my supposedly wayward faith actually looked like. They could see Tommy Richardson getting information about job training programs. They could see Miss Patterson sitting with one of our volunteers, finally having someone listen to her loneliness. They could see the Martinez children wearing warm coats that might help them get through another difficult winter. Miss Evans, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally stepped forward. Carol, she said firmly, I think you need to stop talking and start looking. Looking at what? At what your daughter has actually done here today. At the people she's helped, the needs she's met, the love she's shown. You're so busy being angry about her choices that you can't see the fruit they're producing. The fruit, Carol snapped, is division and rebellion and disrespect for authority. The fruit, Miss Evans replied, is hungry people being fed and lonely people being comforted, and families in crisis being supported.
If that's what rebellion looks like, then maybe we need more of it. Several people in the crowd murmured agreement, and I could see Carol's confident facade beginning to crack. This wasn't going the way she had planned. The community wasn't rallying to her side the way she had expected. Instead, they were witnessing her publicly berate her own daughter for the crime of helping people without requiring religious conformity. Pastor Clark, clearly recognizing that the situation had become a public relations disaster for the church, tried one final time to regain control. I think we're all getting a bit emotional here, he said, his pastoral voice attempting to smooth over the growing tension. Why don't we table this discussion for now and arrange a private meeting where we can address these concerns properly? There's nothing to address, I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. I'm not ashamed of what I'm doing here,
I'm not embarrassed by my faith community or my choices. I'm proud to be part of a church that cares more about serving people than judging them. And I'm heartbroken, Carol replied, tears starting to stream down her cheeks, that I raised a daughter who would rather show off for strangers than respect the people who love her most. The tears were genuine, and they hit me like a physical blow. This was my mother, the woman who had rocked me to sleep and celebrated my achievements and worried about my future. Seeing her cry in front of the entire community felt like watching something precious shatter into irreparable pieces. But I also realized, with a clarity that was both painful and liberating, that her tears were not about love, they were about control. She wasn't crying because I was lost or in danger. She was crying because I had chosen a path she couldn't dictate, become a person she couldn't manage, developed a faith she couldn't supervise. Mom, I said quietly, I do respect you. But respect doesn't mean agreeing with everything you believe or making choices based on what you want instead of what I believe is right. What you believe is right, she repeated, her voice breaking with emotion. What about what God believes is right? What about honoring your parents and submitting to spiritual authority? What about loving your neighbor as yourself? What about not judging others? What about showing mercy to those who need it most? We stood there staring at each other across a distance that felt much wider than the few feet of asphalt separating us. Around us, the community that had known us both for years watched this very public dissolution of a family relationship that should have been resolved with private conversation and mutual love. Finally, Pastor Clark placed a hand on Carol's shoulder. Carol, I think we should go inside and pray about this situation. She nodded, wiping her eyes with a tissue someone had handed her. But before turning to leave, she looked at me one more time. When you're ready to come home and ask forgiveness for the pain you've caused, she said, her voice steady despite her tears, you know where to find us. Then she walked back across the street with Pastor Clark and the deacons, leaving me standing in the middle of what had become a very public battlefield in a war I had never wanted to fight. But as I looked around at the people still gathering supplies, at the volunteers still offering help, at the community members who had witnessed the confrontation and chosen to stay and support what we were doing, I realized something important. I might have lost my family of origin, but I had gained something else. A community of choice based on shared values rather than shared blood, a faith grounded in service rather than submission, and the knowledge that sometimes standing up for what you believe is worth the cost of what you lose. The war Carol had started was far from over, but for the first time since Easter Sunday, I was no longer afraid of fighting it. The next morning, I woke up in my apartment to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Word of the confrontation outside First Baptist had spread through Millbrook faster than gossip at a church potluck. Some messages were supportive, others critical, but all of them made one thing clear. The quiet family disagreement that had started at Easter dinner was now the talk of the entire town. Kyle's message came in at 6:30 in the morning. Holy cow, Mom says half the church is talking about what happened yesterday. Some people are furious with Aunt Carol, others think you deliberately humiliated her. This is getting ugly fast. Paige's text was more direct. Saw the video, you're trending on the Millbrook Facebook page. Also, someone recorded the whole thing and posted it online. We need to talk. Video. My stomach dropped as I realized that our very public confrontation had been captured by someone's phone and was now circulating through social media. The private family conflict that had started with a slap over Easter dinner was now digital entertainment for anyone curious about small-town drama. I found the video on the Millbrook Community News Facebook page, where it had already accumulated over 300 views and dozens of comments. The footage was shaky and the audio somewhat unclear, but it captured enough of the confrontation to tell the story. A young woman providing free food and services to community members while her mother and former pastor berated her for abandoning proper Christian values. The comments section was a battlefield of competing narratives. Some people defended Carol, arguing that children should respect their parents regardless of disagreements. Others criticized her for publicly shaming her daughter, who was obviously trying to help people. Several community members who had been present added their own accounts of what they witnessed. Mrs. Patterson had written, I've been lonely since my husband died and nobody from any church has bothered to check on me in months. But this young woman spent 20 minutes just listening to me talk about missing Harold. Actions speak louder than sermons. Tommy Richardson added, been struggling since I got back from Afghanistan and can't find work. Most people cross the street when they see me coming. These folks treated me with respect and connected me with job training resources. Don't know what kind of Christian values y'all think she abandoned, but the ones she's got seem to be working just fine.
but there were plenty of critics too. Someone named Jennifer wrote, "This is what happens when young people think they know better than their elders. Respect your parents and honor the church that raised you. Some things are more important than making yourself look good by giving away free stuff." Another commenter named Robert added, "Carol Hamilton is a godly woman who's raised her daughter right. If that daughter chooses rebellion over respect, that's on her, not on the family that tried to teach her proper value." The video had been shared to other regional Facebook groups, and I could see it spreading beyond Millbrook to surrounding communities. My personal conflict with my family was becoming a regional discussion about faith, family loyalty, and generational differences in Christian practice. By noon, I had received a call from Janet Morrison, a reporter for the Millbrook Gazette, asking if I wanted to comment on the incident at the church. I declined, but the fact that local media was interested suggested this story had legs beyond social media gossip. That afternoon, Pastor Miller called with news that was both encouraging and concerning. "Brooke," she said, "I've had 6 phone calls this morning from people in Millbrook who want to know more about New Hope. Apparently our community care day made quite an impression. Good impressions or bad ones? Mixed, but mostly people who were impressed by what they saw and want to know more about a church that puts service into action." Mrs. Patterson specifically asked about our grief support group. That was encouraging. If something positive could come from this mess, maybe it would be worth the personal cost. "But," Pastor Miller continued, "I also got a call from Pastor Clark. He's not happy about our involvement in what he considers an internal church matter." "What did he say?" "He accused us of predatory ministry practices, trying to steal members from his congregation by creating division within families. He suggested that we deliberately orchestrated yesterday's events to make his church look bad." The accusation was ridiculous but also concerning. If Pastor Clark was telling other area ministers that New Hope was engaging in unethical recruitment tactics, it could damage our church's reputation throughout the region. That's completely false. The Community Care Day was my idea, and it had nothing to do with recruiting church members. I know that, and I told him so, but he's threatening to contact the Regional Ministerial Association to lodge a formal complaint against me for interfering in his pastoral relationship with a former member. This was escalating beyond family drama into professional consequences for people who had tried to support me. Pastor Miller could face scrutiny from other ministers in the area, potentially damaging her ministry and New Hope's relationships with other churches. "Pastor Miller, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to cause problems for you or the church." "Brooke, stop. You haven't caused problems for anyone. You organized a community service event that helped real people with real needs. The fact that some people are threatened by that says more about them than it does about you." But I could hear the strain in her voice, and I knew this was costing her more than she was willing to admit. That evening, Dennis called me for the first time since Easter. His voice was gruff and tired, lacking the booming confidence I was accustomed to. "Brooke, this has gone too far." "Hi to you too, Dad. Don't get smart with me. Do you have any idea what you've done to your mother? She's been crying for 3 days. She's embarrassed to leave the house. People are talking about our family like we're some kind of soap opera." "Dad, I was trying to help people. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. By setting up that spectacle right across from our church? By making your mother look like some kind of villain in front of the whole community?" His interpretation of events stung because it contained enough truth to feel convincing. I had chosen the location deliberately, knowing it would be visible to church members. I had wanted to demonstrate my faith publicly, which inevitably meant contrasting it with their approach. I wanted to show people what my faith actually looks like instead of letting everyone believe I'd abandoned Christian values. And you couldn't do that without humiliating the people who raised you? The question hit me like a physical blow. Had I humiliated them? Had my desire to vindicate myself resulted in public shame for my parents? I didn't mean to humiliate anyone. I was just trying to defend myself against accusations that weren't fair. "Fair?" Dennis's voice rose slightly. "You think it's fair to make your mother cry in front of the entire community? You think it's fair to drag our family business into the public square for everyone to judge? You and Mom made it public first when you asked the church to pray for my rebellious heart." "I was just responding to accusations you'd already made public. We asked for prayer from our church family because we're worried about you. That's not the same as staging some kind of publicity stunt designed to make us look bad." We were talking past each other, operating from completely different understandings of what had happened and why. From his perspective, I was a rebellious daughter who had escalated a private family matter into public humiliation. From mine, I was defending myself against unfair public accusations,
by demonstrating the reality of my faith. Dad, do you really think I set up that service day just to embarrass you and Mom? There was a long pause before he answered. I think you've gotten caught up in proving how right you are and how wrong we are. I think you care more about winning some kind of argument than you do about your family. The accusation felt like a knife between my ribs, partially because I wondered if it might be true. Had my desire to vindicate myself overshadowed my love for my family? Had I been more concerned with being right than with maintaining relationships? That's not what I intended, but it's what you. And now your mother is so upset she can barely function. And our church family is divided between people who think we're terrible parents, and people who think you're a disrespectful daughter. Either way, our family is broken, and it's public knowledge. So what do you want me to do? I want you to call your mother and apologize. I want you to acknowledge that you handled this wrong, that you hurt people you claim to love. I want you to stop making this about theology and start making it about family. And then what? Pretend I agree with things I don't believe. Go back to First Baptist and act like nothing has changed. I want you to act like an adult who understands that being part of a family sometimes means putting other people's feelings ahead of your own need to be right. After he hung up, I sat in my apartment staring at the phone, feeling more confused and guilty than I had since this whole mess started. Was Dennis right? Had I let my desire to defend myself override my consideration for my family's feelings? But even as I wrestled with guilt, I couldn't shake the memory of Mrs. Martinez talking about how we had treated her children with dignity, or Tommy Richardson's gratitude for being connected with job training resources. Whatever mistakes I might have made in handling the family conflict, the actual service work had been genuinely helpful to real people with real needs. Tuesday morning brought a knock on my apartment door from someone I didn't expect. Miss Evans, holding a covered casserole dish and wearing a determined expression. Mrs. Evans, what are you doing here? I came to bring you some comfort food and to have a conversation that's long overdue, she said, walking into my apartment without waiting for an invitation. I hope you like tuna noodle casserole, because I made enough to feed a small army. She set the dish on my kitchen counter and turned to face me with the kind of direct gaze that had probably terrified generations of Sunday school students. Brooke Hamilton, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, and I've watched this situation unfold with more concern than I can properly express. Mrs. Evans, I know the whole thing has been. Hush now and let me finish. I've been going to First Baptist for 47 years. I've seen pastors come and go, watched families grow up and move away, weathered more church conflicts than I care to count. And what I witnessed on Sunday was the most shameful display of unchristian behavior I've seen in decades. I blinked at her, not sure if she was referring to my actions or my family's. Your mother and Pastor Clark stood in front of God and everybody and criticized you for feeding hungry people and helping families in need. They accused you of abandoning Christian values, while you were actively demonstrating those values for anyone with eyes to see. But I did choose the location deliberately. I knew it would create a confrontation. Of course you did. You're not stupid. But creating a confrontation, and being wrong about the underlying issue, are two different things entirely. She moved to my couch and settled herself with the authority of someone planning to stay until her business was finished. Sit down, child. We need to talk about some things your parents apparently never taught you about faith and family. I sat, feeling like I was about to receive the Sunday school lesson I'd been missing my entire life. First, she began, being a good Christian doesn't mean agreeing with everything your parents believe or doing everything they want you to do. It means following Christ, even when that leads you in directions your family doesn't understand. But the Bible says to honor your father and mother. It does indeed, but it also says that anyone who loves father or mother more than Christ is not worthy of him. Sometimes honoring your parents means loving them enough to be honest about who you are, even if that honesty makes them uncomfortable. I had never heard Miss Evans speak with such theological confidence, and certainly never in defense of someone who had publicly disagreed with church leadership. Second, she continued, I've been watching your mother for years, and I love her dearly. But Carol has always confused being right with being faithful. She thinks that if she can control everyone around her into making choices she approves of, that somehow makes her a better Christian. She just wants what's best for me. She wants what's comfortable for her. There's a difference. What's best for you is becoming the person God created you to be, not the person your mother feels safe with. Mrs. Evans reached over and patted my hand with the kind of gentle firmness that only church ladies possess. Third, and this is important, your faith community should be judged by its fruits, not by its traditions or its reputation, or how long it's been around. I saw the fruits of your new church on Sunday, and they looked pretty good to me. Miss Evans, are you saying you think I should leave First Baptist? Honey, I think you already have left First Baptist. The question is whether you're going to spend the rest of your life feeling guilty about it or whether you're going to embrace the path God has put you on. She stood up, smoothing down her skirt with the same precise movements I remembered from childhood. Now I need to tell you something else, and I want you to listen carefully. There are people in our church who have been troubled by how this whole situation has been handled. Pastor Clark and your mother are not speaking for all of us, and they're certainly not speaking for Christ. What do you mean? I mean, there's going to be a meeting Thursday night at my house. Several church members want to discuss what we witnessed on Sunday and what it says about our Christian witness in the community. You might be interested in what comes out of that conversation. With that cryptic statement, she headed for the door, pausing only to add, "Eat that casserole while it's still warm. Comfort food doesn't work as well when it's cold." After she left, I sat in my kitchen eating tuna noodle casserole and trying to process what had just happened. Miss Evans, one of the most respected members of First Baptist, had essentially validated my choices and criticized the church leadership's response. More importantly, she had suggested that other church members shared her concern. Wednesday evening brought another unexpected visitor, Carol herself, standing at my apartment door with red-rimmed eyes and a trembling chin. "Mom," the word came out as barely more than a whisper. "May I come in?" I stepped aside, and she entered my apartment cautiously, as if she weren't sure she would be welcome. She looked around at my small but comfortable home, her gaze lingering on the cross-stitch sampler she had made for my college graduation, now hanging prominently above my desk. "You kept it," she said softly. "Of course I kept it. It's beautiful, and you made it for me." She sat down heavily on my couch, looking older and more fragile than I had ever seen her. "Brooke, I came to apologize." The words hit me like a physical shock. In 25 years I could count on one hand the number of times Carol had apologized for anything. "Mom, no, let me finish. I need to say this." She took a shaky breath. "I should never have slapped you on Easter. I should never have made our disagreement public by asking for church prayers. And I should never have confronted you in front of the entire community on Sunday." I felt tears starting to blur my vision. This was what I had been hoping for since Easter Sunday. Acknowledgement that the situation had been handled badly. Recognition that I had been hurt by her actions. "Thank you for saying that." But she continued, and I felt my heart sink as I realized there was more coming. "I still believe you made wrong choices. I still think you've been influenced by people who don't understand proper biblical teaching. And I still think you deliberately chose to embarrass your father and me in front of our community." The partial apology felt worse than no apology at all. She was willing to acknowledge tactical mistakes while maintaining that I was fundamentally wrong about everything that mattered. "Mom, why did you come here if you still think I'm wrong about everything?" "Because you're my daughter, and I love you and I can't stand the thought of our family being broken forever over a disagreement about church." "It's not just about church, Mom. It's about respect and autonomy and being able to make my own spiritual decisions without being judged or condemned." "But your spiritual decisions affect more than just you, Brooke. They affect your family, your community, the witness you bear as someone who was raised in the faith." We were right back where we started, circling the same fundamental disagreement that had caused this mess in the first place. She saw my choices as rebellion against authority. I saw them as growth toward authenticity. "So what do you want from me?" "I want you to come home. I want you to sit down with Pastor Clark and work through these spiritual issues you're struggling with. I want you to give First Baptist another chance before you decide to abandon everything we taught you. And if I don't want to do that." Her expression hardened slightly, the vulnerability I had seen moments earlier replaced by familiar resolve. "Then I guess we'll have to learn to live with the consequences of the choices we've both made." After she left, I sat in my apartment feeling more confused and heartbroken than ever. She had offered what sounded like reconciliation, but only on condition that I admit I was wrong and submit to the spiritual authority she trusted. It wasn't really forgiveness or acceptance, it was negotiation. Thursday evening, curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself driving back to Millbrook to park across the street from Mrs. Evans's house. I could see lights on in her living room and several cars in the driveway, but I couldn't bring myself to go to the door. Whatever was being discussed inside, I wasn't sure I was ready to hear it.
My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Look in your rearview mirror." I turned to see Kyle walking up to my car from where he had apparently been waiting in his own vehicle. "What are you doing here?" I asked, as he got into my passenger seat. "Same thing you are, wondering what the church ladies are plotting in there." "Church ladies?" "Mom says half the women's auxiliary is in that living room right now, along with 2 of the deacons and at least 1 choir member."
Apparently, Mrs. Evans called a meeting to discuss Christian witness and family relationships in crisis. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the house where my spiritual fate might be being decided by people I had grown up respecting and trusting. "Kyle, do you think I handled this whole thing wrong? I think you handled it like someone who was backed into a corner and fighting for her right to exist as an independent adult. Could you have been more diplomatic?" "Maybe. But diplomacy is a luxury that people who have power can afford. You were being spiritually bullied, and you fought back the only way you knew how. By embarrassing my parents in public. By refusing to be ashamed of choices you made for good reasons. There's a difference." As we watched, the front door of Miss Evans's house opened, and people began filing out into the night. I recognized most of them, longtime church members, people who had taught my Sunday school classes and supervised my youth group activity. They stood on the front porch talking quietly for several minutes before dispersing to their cars. As the last car pulled away, Mrs. Evans stepped outside and looked directly at my vehicle. Even from across the street, I could see her gesturing for me to come over. "Busted," Kyle said with a grin. "Might as well go see what the verdict is." We walked across the street to where Mrs. Evans waited on her front porch, arms crossed but smiling slightly. Brooke Hamilton and Kyle Hamilton, lurking in the shadows like a couple of teenagers sneaking out past curfew. "Sorry, Miss Evans," I said sheepishly. I was curious about the meeting, but I didn't want to intrude. "Well, you might as well come in and hear what we decided, since it concerns you directly." Her living room still smelled like coffee and the lingering perfume of church ladies who take their community responsibilities seriously. She gestured for us to sit while she settled into her favorite chair. We had quite a discussion tonight about Christian witness, family loyalty, and the proper response to conflict within the church community. "And what did you decide?" "We decided that Pastor Clark and your mother handled this situation poorly, and that the church owes you an apology for the way you were publicly criticized for doing exactly what Christians are supposed to do." I felt my mouth fall open in shock. "The church owes me an apology." "Furthermore," she continued, "we decided that any church member who wants to participate in community service with other Christian organizations should be free to do so without having their spiritual maturity questioned or their family loyalty challenged." "Miss Evans, what exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that several of us plan to approach Pastor Clark about issuing a public statement acknowledging that Sunday's confrontation was handled inappropriately. We're also going to suggest that First Baptist should be partnering with community service efforts rather than criticizing them." Kyle whistled softly. "That's going to go over well with Pastor Clark. Pastor Clark will either recognize wisdom when he hears it, or he'll discover that longtime church members can find other places to worship when their concerns aren't taken seriously." The implied threat was subtle but unmistakable. Miss Evans and her allies were prepared to leave First Baptist if Pastor Clark didn't change his approach to this situation. "But what about my family? What about the division this has caused?" "Honey, the division was caused by people who couldn't accept that you've grown beyond their ability to control you. That's not your fault, and it's not something you can fix by making yourself smaller." As Kyle and I drove back toward Nashville, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Easter Sunday. Hope. Not hope that everything would go back to the way it was, but hope that something new and better might emerge from the wreckage of what had been broken. The war Carol had started was finally revealing its true battle lines, and they weren't where anyone had expected them to be. 3 weeks later, I stood in the kitchen of my Nashville apartment, watching steam rise from my coffee mug, and wondering if the strange calm I felt was healing or just exhaustion. The phone calls had finally stopped. The Facebook comments had moved on to other drama. The immediate crisis that had consumed my life since Easter had settled into something more manageable, a new normal built on different foundations than the old one. The turning point had come the previous Sunday, though I hadn't been there to witness it personally. Kyle had called me that afternoon, his voice containing an excitement I hadn't heard in months. "Brooke, you're not going to believe what happened at First Baptist this morning. Try me." Miss Evans stood up during the announcement time and asked Pastor Clark if she could address the congregation about Christian service and community witness. I nearly dropped my phone. Mrs. Evans was many things, but a public confrontation wasn't usually her style. And he couldn't really say no without looking petty. So she got up in front of everyone and gave what Mom is calling the most gracious tongue lashing in church history. According to Kyle's account, Miss Evans had spoken for nearly 10 minutes about the importance of judging Christian faithfulness by its fruits rather than its adherence to tradition. She had specifically mentioned the Community Care Day, describing it as an example of faith in action that the church should be celebrating rather than criticizing. She didn't mention you by name, Kyle continued, but everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. And when she finished, about half the congregation started applauding. What did Pastor Clark do? Looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. But here's the best part. After the service, 17 people approached Mrs. Evans asking how they could get involved in similar community service projects. She's organizing a group to partner with New Hope on monthly outreach events. The news felt surreal. The church that had publicly questioned my spiritual maturity was now organizing to participate in the kind of ministry I had been criticized for supporting. What about Mom and Dad? Kyle's pause told me everything I needed to know before he spoke. They left during Mrs. Evans's comments. Haven't been back since. So while the church community was healing and moving forward, my immediate family remained entrenched in their position. It wasn't the happy ending I had hoped for, but it was progress of a different kind. That afternoon, I had driven to Millbrook to meet with Mrs. Evans and the group she was organizing. The gathering took place in the church fellowship hall, with permission from the board of deacons who had apparently overruled Pastor Clark's initial objection. Seeing familiar faces from my childhood gathered around folding tables, planning ways to serve their community more effectively, felt like watching a miracle unfold in slow motion. These were people who had taught me Bible verses and helped raise money for mission trips and celebrated my achievements through high school and college. Mrs. Patterson was there, volunteering to coordinate grief support services. Mr. Thompson, one of the deacons who had initially confronted me, offered to use his construction skills for home repair projects. Even Jennifer Williams, who had been one of Carol's closest friends and harshest critics of my choices, had shown up to ask about organizing a children's clothing drive. I realize I may have been too quick to judge your motivations, she told me during a break in the planning session. Seeing what you actually accomplished made me think about what my faith should be producing in my own life. The apology was simple and direct, the kind that actually meant something because it came with changed behavior rather than just changed words. Pastor Clark had not attended the meeting, though his absence spoke louder than his presence might have. Mrs. Evans had mentioned in passing that he was reconsidering his approach to community partnerships, which I interpreted to mean that he was being pressured by church leadership to be more supportive or risk losing members. But the most meaningful conversation of the afternoon came from Tommy Richardson, the veteran who had been at our original Community Care Day. Miss Hamilton, he said as the meeting was winding down, I wanted you to know that I started that job training program you connected me with. Got hired at the automotive plant in Franklin. First steady work I've had since I got back from overseas. His words hit me like a physical embrace. All the family drama and church politics and community gossip faded into background noise compared to the reality that someone's life had been tangibly improved by what we had done. Tommy, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you. I just wanted you to know that whatever else people are saying about what you did, it made a real difference for me and my family. Sometimes the right thing causes trouble, but that doesn't make it wrong. Driving back to Nashville that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this whole ordeal began. Peace that wasn't contingent on other people's approval or disapproval. Tommy had steady work. Mrs. Martinez's children had warm clothes. Mrs. Patterson had found a grief support group. The fruits of our community care efforts were real and lasting, regardless of what anyone thought about my family relationships or church attendance. But the price of that peace was still heavy. Carol and Dennis hadn't spoken to me since her visit to my apartment 3 weeks earlier. They had missed my 26th birthday the previous weekend, the first time in my life that had happened. When I drove through Millbrook for the church meeting, I had deliberately avoided their street, not wanting to deal with the emotional complexity of seeing their house and wondering if they were home. The silence from them was different from the silence I had experienced immediately after Easter. That first silence had felt like punishment, designed to pressure me into compliance. This silence felt more like mourning, as if they were grieving the daughter they thought they had lost. In some ways I was grieving too, not for the choices I had made, but for the family relationships I had hoped were possible but apparently weren't. I had wanted parents who could celebrate my spiritual growth even when it took unfamiliar form. I had wanted a family that could disagree about theology while still maintaining love and respect. I had wanted people who would trust my character and judgment even when they didn't understand my decision. Those wants weren't unreasonable, but they also weren't achievable with the parents I actually had. Carol and Dennis loved me according to their understanding of love, but their love was conditional on compliance in ways I was no longer willing to accept. The realization was both liberating and heartbreaking. 2 days before Thanksgiving, Paige knocked on my apartment door with a bottle of wine and a determined expression. "Okay," she announced, settling onto my couch with the authority of someone planning an intervention. "We're going to talk about holidays." "What about that?" "About the fact that you're planning to spend Thanksgiving alone in this apartment, feeling sorry for yourself instead of celebrating with people who actually appreciate you." She wasn't wrong. I had turned down invitations from coworkers, declined Kyle's offer to include me in his family's celebration, and politely refused Pastor Miller's suggestion that I join the New Hope community dinner. The idea of participating in family-style gatherings while my actual family remained estranged felt too complicated emotionally. "I'm not feeling sorry for myself, I'm just not in the mood for celebrating." "Bullshit. You're wallowing and I'm not going to let you do it." Paige had perfected the art of loving confrontation during her years as a counselor, and she deployed it now with surgical precision. "Brooke, what you've been through is hard. Losing family relationships over matters of conscience is genuinely painful. But isolating yourself and refusing to build new traditions with people who support you isn't healing. It's self-punishment. I don't know how to be thankful when everything feels so broken. Then let me help you remember." She pulled out her phone and opened the notes. "Tommy Richardson has a job. Mrs. Martinez's kids have warm clothes for winter. Mrs. Patterson joined a grief support group, where she's made 3 new friends. The Martinez family found permanent housing through a program they learned about at our care day. 2 families we helped that day have started attending New Hope, and are now volunteering with other service projects." Each item on her list represented a real person whose life had been improved by the community care efforts that had cost me my family relation. When she put it that way, the trade-off seemed more clearly worthwhile, and she continued, 17 people from your childhood church are now actively involved in community service projects because of the example you set. That's not broken, Brooke, that's transformation. But your parents made their choice. They chose control over relationship, compliance over love, judgment over grace. That's painful and it's not fair, but it's not your fault and it's not something you can fix by making yourself smaller. She was right, of course. I had spent months trying to figure out how to restore family relationships that had been broken by my growth rather than by any actual wrongdoing on my part. The restoration I was seeking required me to become someone I was no longer willing to be. So what do you suggest? I suggest you come to my family's Thanksgiving celebration, where you'll be welcomed as you are rather than judged for who you're not. I suggest you start building traditions with your chosen family instead of mourning the limitations of your biological one. Paige's family lived in a rambling farmhouse outside Nashville, the kind of place where extra guests were always welcome and conversations could range from politics to theology, without anyone getting slapped or excommunicated. Her parents, both retired teachers, had spent decades welcoming students and young professionals who needed a place to belong during holiday. Thanksgiving dinner at the Winters house was everything I had hoped family gatherings could be: warm, inclusive, and focused on gratitude rather than compliance. The table conversation included discussions about faith, but they were explorative rather than dogmatic. People disagreed about various topics, but the disagreements were handled with curiosity and respect rather than anger and judgment. After dinner, as I helped clear dishes while Paige's mother regaled us with stories about her former students, I realized I was experiencing something I hadn't felt in months: belonging without performance. These people liked me because of who I was, not despite. They were interested in my opinions rather than threatened by them. They celebrated my service work rather than criticizing my motivations. "Brooke," Paige's father said as we finished loading the dishwasher, "Paige tells us you've been through a difficult time with your family recently." That's one way to put it. I spent 40 years teaching high school and I saw a lot of young people struggle with family expectations that didn't match their authentic selves. It's always hard when the people who raised you can't accept the person you've become. His words were gentle but direct, acknowledging the pain without trying to minimize it or offer easy solutions. "The thing I learned," he continued, "is that some families grow together and some families grow apart. The ones that grow apart aren't necessarily doing anything wrong. They're just developing in incompatible directions. So what happens then? Then you grieve what you hoped for and celebrate what you actually have. You build new traditions with people who appreciate your growth rather than spending your life trying to convince people who don't. That night, driving back to my apartment with leftover turkey and a container of Paige's mother's famous apple pie, I felt something shift inside me. The grief over my family relationships was still there, but it was no longer the dominant emotion. It had been joined by gratitude for the community I had found, excitement about the work I was doing, and genuine hope for the future I was building. December brought news that Carol and Dennis had left First Baptist. According to Kyle, they had found a smaller, more conservative congregation about 30 minutes from Millbrook, where the pastor shared their views about proper biblical interpretation and family authority. Mom says they're happier there, Kyle told me during our weekly phone call. No one questions their positions or challenges their beliefs. It's exactly what they were looking for. The irony wasn't lost on me. Carol and Dennis had criticized me for leaving my home church when their beliefs evolved, only to leave their own church when the community wouldn't support their approach to family conflict. Are they doing okay otherwise? They seem to be. Dad mentioned you at Christmas, actually. Said he hoped you were happy with your choices. It wasn't an apology or an invitation to reconciliation, but it wasn't condemnation either. Maybe it was the closest thing to acceptance I was going to get from them. Christmas Eve found me at New Hope's candlelight service, surrounded by people who had become my chosen family over the past year. The sanctuary was decorated simply but beautifully, filled with the kind of warm light that makes everything feel possible. Pastor Miller's message was about the radical nature of God's love, about how it shows up in unexpected places, and through imperfect people who are brave enough to act on their convictions even when it costs them something precious. As we lit candles and sang Silent Night, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The path from Easter Sunday to Christmas Eve had been harder than anything I could have imagined, but it had also been more transformative than I had thought possible. I had lost the family I was born into, but I had gained a community chosen by shared values rather than shared blood. I had lost the comfortable certainty of unquestioned beliefs, but I had gained a deeper, more nuanced faith that could withstand difficult questions. I had lost the approval of people whose approval I had spent my life seeking, but I had gained the more valuable prize of my own integrity. After the service, as people lingered to share Christmas greetings and warm embraces, Mrs. Evans appeared at my side. She had started attending New Hope regularly after the Community Care Day, finding in our congregation the kind of active faith she had been seeking for years. "Brooke," she said, "I wanted to tell you something before I lose my nerve." "What's that, Mrs. Evans?" "I've been thinking about what happened with your family, and I realize now that some of us at First Baptist failed you long before that confrontation in the street. How do you mean? We let you grow up thinking that being a good Christian meant never disagreeing with authority, never asking difficult questions, never developing your own understanding of what faith should look like. We taught you to be compliant instead of teaching you to be faithful." Her words hit me with unexpected force, acknowledging something I had felt but never been able to articulate. "Mrs. Evans, you were always kind to me. You supported my questions and encouraged my growth. Not enough, not publicly, not when it might have made a difference." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "What I want you to know is that the woman you've become, the faith you're living, the service you're doing, the courage you've shown, that's the woman we should have been helping you become all along." As I drove home through the quiet Christmas Eve streets of Nashville, Mrs. Evans's words echoed in my mind like a benediction. For the first time since Easter Sunday, I felt completely at peace with the choices I had made and the person I was becoming. The lights of the city sparkled around me like promises of possibilities yet to be explored. Tomorrow would bring Christmas Day, and next week would bring a new year full of opportunities to serve, to grow, to love, and to be loved in return. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at it when I stopped at a red light. It was from an unknown number, but the message made my heart skip. "Merry Christmas, daughter. Despite everything, we love you." Mom and Dad. It wasn't an apology or an invitation to return to the way things were, but it was acknowledgement, connection, the first crack in a wall that had seemed impermeable. Maybe it would lead to something more, or maybe it would remain the only communication we shared. Either way, it was enough for tonight. I parked in my apartment complex and sat for a moment in the quiet darkness, looking up at the stars barely visible through the city's glow. Somewhere in the distance, church bells were chiming midnight, marking the transition from Christmas Eve to Christmas Day.
Both.
The journey that had begun with a slap over Easter dinner had led me here, to a community that celebrated my growth, to work that made a difference in real life, to faith that could weather questions and doubts and difficult choices, to the knowledge that sometimes losing everything you thought you needed is the only way to find everything you actually want. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, unlocked my door, and stepped into the home I had built with my own hands and my own choices. It was smaller than the house I grew up in, simpler than the life my parents had planned for me, but it was mine in a way nothing had ever been before. On my kitchen table sat the chocolate cake I had bought for Easter dinner nearly 9 months earlier, the one I had carried away from that disastrous family gathering. I had kept it in my freezer all this time, not quite sure why. Now I took it out, let it thaw, and cut myself a slice. It tasted like freedom. It tasted like new beginnings. It tasted like the sweetness that can only come after you've walked through bitter disappointment and emerged on the other side with your integrity intact. As I ate cake at midnight on Christmas morning, I whispered a prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought me home to myself. Sometimes the most important Easter resurrections happen not in spring, but in the deep winter of the soul, when everything appears dead but new life is quietly preparing to emerge. The woman who had been slapped for being ungrateful at Easter dinner was gone. In her place sat someone who understood the difference between gratitude and compliance, between love and control, between faith and fear. And she was exactly who she was meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.